Good evening. Welcome to the September 28th study session of the Stillwater City Council. And I guess the Utilities Authority. Which one are we doing? Are we doing these together? Joint meeting of the Stillwater City Council and the Stillwater Utilities Authority. Both on study session tonight. We just have the one item on the agenda under general orders. We're going to discuss the future water treatment plant and pipeline improvements. And we have Bill Millis and Monty Carnes with us here tonight to lead the discussion.
Monty Carnes, Director of City Engineering. Make a few comments before Bill starts the presentation. First, want to clarify that we will not be asking you to make any decisions tonight. This is just to start a discussion of needs. We will, at the conclusion, be suggesting a course of action that we think we should follow. This came about after Water Utility Engineering did an assessment at the water treatment plant that started out from some operational needs that the staff out there had. That identified some $70 million worth of improvements that needed to be done. And in reviewing that, we questioned whether we should put $70 million into an asset that's close to 40 years old, and in my view, has poor bones. The plant was designed by, and I don't intend this to be critical at all of anyone, but it is a fact that when that was designed and the pipeline some 40 years ago, as a community, we went over to Tulsa and got arguably the best pipeline designers in the world to do the pipeline design. And why would you not do that? Or at least consider it. And then, because they had design experience in refineries and large facilities such as that, why would you not consider them to do your water treatment plant? The fallacy there was they came from the energy industry, where the basic capital improvement in that industry is you design your capital asset at the lowest cost possible, even at the increase of maintenance and operation cost, because in a high profit environment, you can deduct those ongoing costs every year from your taxes. Whereas if you put it into the asset, you have to depreciate that over a long period of time. So it makes tax sense to do it that way, which is just the opposite of what you do in municipality, because we have trouble coming up with operational and maintenance costs. So we have issues that stem back from that basic design. And Thomas is here, he can go into that in quite in depth. And there were some other issues as well, as, what's standard in a refinery is not standard design practice at a treatment plant. Similarly, the raw water line is also close to 40 years old. There really was never any terminal storage at the water treatment plant. And the idea was, and again, it's not a bad idea, we had OSU treatment plant as a backup and the water supply from Lake Carl Blackwell and at that time Lake McMurtry. As the system has expanded, it's a little difficult to get that water from the water treatment plant to the higher elevations in town without doing some improvements to the system that we may want to do, but right now that's a little challenging. So looking at all of that, I asked the water utility engineering staff to put together some options for dealing with both and what those expenses might be. Our water utility engineering staff is very busy with other projects, so they had to work this in, and they've done a very, very excellent job, and very proud of the work they have done. But it's a very high-level look, and it's a very rough cost estimates that you're going to look at tonight. So we in no way think this is a finished product. Again, it's just a place to start the discussion. Some of our needs out there are urgent, and we'll discuss that a little further later. So I'm happy to answer any questions quickly before we turn it over to Bill and let him make the presentation. Okay.
Good evening. I'm Bill Millis, Water Utilities Engineering Director. And we've previously informed you about some of the ongoing and upcoming significant needs at the water treatment plant. As Monty mentioned, in the neighborhood of 70 million. And I do have a PowerPoint, if we could show that on the screen, please. We also have similar needs and projects upcoming with the Call water line and ultimately with the Call pump station as well, with similar, very large expenses. So given the age of those critical infrastructures, we want to take the opportunity to give you the background and the framework to decide how to move forward and make the best investment for our long-term future. And we use a 50-year planning horizon when we're talking about these kind of infrastructure investments. So while the numbers that we're going to be looking at are very large, so also is the time frame we're considering. And we'll start with the water treatment plant, and then we'll move on to the raw water infrastructure. This is a shot of the Call pump station if you haven't seen that before. Here I have an overview of the water treatment plant just to kind of facilitate our talking about it. Flow through the plant on the screen is right to left with the raw water storage on the right. Those look like 3 stacked circles is kind of the heart of the treatment. That's solids contact units, or SCU clarifiers. And then kind of in the middle of the screen is the 2 clear wells, and then the pump station from where all the treated water is pumped out to the distribution system. I'll apologize in advance if I use shorthand or technical terms. Feel free to kind of raise your hand and I'll back up and explain. So some of the current projects that we have going on at the water treatment plant include a generator, which is under construction, a finished water pump station, which is part of the Water 2040 program, and all these after the generator are in design. Recycles, I showed you in that first picture, they're on the left of the screen. Those are the lagoons where backwash water, blowdown water is stored, and then we recycle. We let the sediment settle out. Up at the top of the screen is where we put the solids, and we recycle the liquids back into the treatment train. So that's a rehab project that's under design right now. We also have pilot projects, which means basically testing a water treatment process scheme to optimize how we treat the water, both for the best water quality there at the plant, but also to make the best of water quality throughout the distribution system. So this project is evaluating the water treatment plant, running some pilot tests, and designing some needed improvements. And this all started with or that current, the last project that I mentioned, started with the need to replace the lime system. That is this X right here. Now, lime is crushed limestone, and that's added in these three SCU basins. And that's, so we are, our plant is called a softening plant. And so that's what the lime does, is it softens the water and helps settle out solids, coagulate, and make it easier to flocculate the floatable solids. So that's kind of the heart. They're in those SCU basins. About the same time that we started the project to replace the lime system, we had changes in key staff, and it came to our attention that there were a whole lot of issues out there. And that's what, so that project evolved into a full evaluation of the water treatment plant and identifying all our needs and prioritizing them. And that's, all these red X's are kind of a summary of that, that all these indicate places where we have issues that need to be addressed. Some of these, the X on the right, you know, that's represents the chemical feed, particularly the ammonia. In 2017, we had a failure of the ammonia system, you know, which resulted in significant consequences and a high cost to address. The lime system that I mentioned frequently needs maintenance, and it's old enough that its spare and replacement parts are obsolete and hard to get. But I want to, the red X's all over the plant looks kind of scary. So I'll try to keep it in proper perspective. The water plant is not falling apart. We produce safe drinking water, and we will continue to do so. And one way we do that is we utilize a multiple barrier approach. So we've got a lot of redundant equipment. We've got ozone disinfection, and we've got chloramine disinfection. And so sometimes those are able to kind of one back up the other. On these chemical injection systems, there might be 2 or 4 injectors, so that anytime one fails or you have to change it out or maintain it, you switch over to the others. So when I talk about failures, they're rarely catastrophic. And I'll say it again, we produce safe drinking water, and we will continue to do so.
And Bill, that's what happened That's what happened in 2017, right? That we had our chloramine system went down, and the backup was the chlorine for further disinfection, so that we still produced safe drinking water despite the change in taste.
Exactly.
Right? Kind of an example of the redundancy in the system. Yes,
sir. That's right. Yeah, the ammonia element completely failed, but we were able to switch to just chlorine alone, which it took a lot of work, because there's a lot of an important switchover between the 2 disinfectants in the distribution system. So when we made that switch, it created a lot of work. When we switched back, it created a lot of work and expense. But we kept the water safe. That was the important thing. So some of these red X's, as we prioritized the needs, staff was able to make some repairs in-house, evaluate the problem, make some permanent repairs. So maybe some things that looked more urgent, we were able to address them so they weren't top of list. Some things they made more temporary fixes that just bought us time until we can develop capital projects. And so due to all these needs and the prioritization I talked about, we've developed a draft facilities plan with the help of a consultant. And this, we've talked with you all about this previously. This is a representative. We have some options that we haven't selected finally yet. But this shows there up in the box that the improvements to the existing plant plus expanding it to a higher flow rate would cost about $70 million. And then as we started the assessment that we're talking about tonight, we wanted to evaluate needs that are not immediate, but that are upcoming in the near future. Some of those I've mentioned, the residuals, liquid and solids, the finished water pump station, an administrative lab and electrical building, and some other miscellaneous items. So here we're looking at approximately, probably in excess of 100 million over the next several years in needs for the plant. So that's, as we pulled together the facilities plan and realized the magnitude of the need, that's the time when we say, okay, this is a huge investment. Is it time to reconsider whether we make that investment here or whether we, look at other alternatives? So this also represents, we've been working on that. This is our current path forward, is improving the plant, making it the long-term investment that's in the best interest of our ratepayers. So I mentioned capacity. So here's, before I move on, I wanted to mention the water treatment plant has a capacity of 18 million gallons per day. All the water treatment options we talk about will assume going to 24 million gallons per day. So this that we just looked at, the current facilities plan, includes an expansion to 24 million gallons a day. The raw water infrastructure does not have an 18 million gallon a day capacity, but we'll talk about that a little later. So I do want to be glad to answer questions, and if not, we'll move on to discussing the options at the treatment plant, and then on to the raw water system.
Bill, could you say that last part again? You say we're talking about upgrades that would bring us to 24 million gallons per day capacity, but the raw water system doesn't have that? Correct.
The raw water system currently does not have 24. I mean, we'll talk about, breaking down here in a few minutes.
Okay.
But I was just bringing that up now. As we talk about water plant, we're currently at 18. All options will take us to 24.
Okay.
And then we'll talk about how to get there on the raw water later in the presentation.
I got you.
So we developed 4 options. The key here from left to right is decreasing reliance on and investment in the current water treatment plant. And left to right is increasing transition or more rapid transition to a new water treatment plant. All 4 options give us safe drinking water with a 50-year time frame, and all 4 take us to 24 MGD. And
Sorry, Bill. Can you talk a little more about, is that 24 MGD number like a goal for a specific reason? Is that what we think we need now? Is that a projection of what we think our needs will be in the future?
Come back to this map. You can see the 3 SCU basins that I mentioned, kind of almost in the middle. Each of those has a capacity of 6 million MGD. So when we think of increasing, the natural increase is to add another one of those to the north and increase the capacity by 6 MGD. So that's the reason for 18 and 24. When we're not at the point of needing to expand to 24 today. And what we've been doing, we'll talk later about when we will be. But what we've been doing with the facilities plan that I've talked about is we've told our consultant, okay, we're not ready to go to 24, but we expect that it's going to happen someday. So if we're designing a new facility, a new filter complex, we want to design it so it's ready for 24 or so it's easily expandable. Mm-hmm. We don't want to build a new one for 18 and then in 5 years be going, okay, we're ready for 24.
Sure.
So the turquoise color at the 4th SCU at the top there, that and that meter vault are essentially the only new infrastructure we would need at this plant to go to 24. Now, we need a lot of rehab and upgrading of other things, but once beyond the current rehabilitation project, that would be the only thing to add to then make that plant ready for, well, plus some, adding some additional pumps, small facilities inside a building, say, that's been set up and ready for it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So the four options, as I said, I'll start with number one, which relies most heavily on the existing plant. We rehabilitate, upgrade, and replace a number of facilities at 18 MGD, being prepared for 24, and then at some point we will expand to 24 MGD. We stay with the existing site. We design the new facilities for a 50-year life. And so we've estimated when that expansion to 24 will come. We've estimated other small improvements that may need to happen sometime, something that's in good condition now, but we don't expect it to last for 50 years.
So Bill, just to be clear on that 50-plus year life is 50 years after all of those things are completed, right? Not 50 years total. In other words, if the plant's 40-plus years old now, we're not getting an extra 10 years out of this.
Right.
Right? Okay.
But it's not, it's 50 years essentially from now. The stuff we're going to build now, we want it to last 50 years.
Right. Okay.
But some other element, like there on the top there, you can see that the expansion to 24 MGD would be in roughly the year 2038.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when we build that facility, we sort of have to make this decision again. We probably build it to last 50 years.
Right.
But so you've got one element that's ready for 50 years, and the other elements are not ready for 50 years.
Right.
So there's always that inequality.
Yeah.
But so we always start from, okay, now we want it to last that long.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to build, a pump doesn't last that long. A pump might last 5 or 10 years. But generally, we want to be looking at a 50-year horizon with the type of investment we have here.
Mm-hmm.
And even the 50 is a bit of a catch-all term, because you should be able to build a concrete basin and it should last longer than 50 years. So, don't take that too literally.
Yeah.
But that explains our thinking in these elements. Okay, so expansion to 24 MGD, roughly at the year 2038. Scenario 2 would include limited rehab at the existing plant, less than what we would do under scenario 1. There may or may not be room on that site to expand or to build a new plant, so we're assuming we'd have to acquire a new site. We would build a new water treatment plant, but in 2 phases. The first phase would be 12 MGD there in the right blue square, roughly 2031. And then a second 12 MGD part of the same new plant in roughly 2041. So during that period from 2031 to 2041, we're running 2 plants, but kind of phasing out the existing treatment plant, putting less investment into it, probably using it more as a peaking plant during the summer rather than all year. Moving to scenario 3, similar to 2, it's a new 24 MGD plant, but we build it all at once in the year roughly 2031. This essentially the same limited rehab at the existing site, and once the new plant is constructed and online, we would abandon the existing treatment plant. Scenario 4, we do no rehab at the existing treatment plant. We just keep it running. We construct a new plant starting now. Instead of 2031, we start that now. And then once the new 24 MGD plant is online, we abandon the existing water treatment plant. And here, this slide just brings them all back together. Hopefully that makes it easier to visualize the differences. So looking at these options, we developed the options, to wrap our arms around the issue and the potential scenarios, but not to select one of these. That's not the main question here. Probably the key question is whether it's time to move toward building a new water treatment plant, and whether we have enough information today to make that decision. So,
Bill, can I ask a question real quick?
sure.
And maybe this is something that can be answered later. You're right, we're not having to select a solution tonight, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And maybe this is a silly question, but you will know the answer to this. Do you think water, I don't know if you call it technology or what, is a lot going to change in the next 11 years when we're talking about 2031? Do you see anything significant to where we would wait for 11 years to start something as opposed to starting something now and kind of building on as technology changes or things change with the water? I mean, do you see one way or the other as far as what would be a better thought process? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. But thanks for setting me up, though, telling me I would be able to answer the question. So there is changing regulations. Usually you see them coming several years down the line. They'll pass a law and it won't be implemented for several years to give communities a chance to implement them. So I don't see, not crystal balling, but those things change relatively slowly, and that's not really, in my mind, a driver for waiting or not. I think it would more be about the investment, and when we make the investment and when we kind of cut investing into the existing plant. It's also about the cost of staying with the existing plant. Sure, because it'd be awful nice to just go now and build a new plant. It'd be, we'd have state-of-the-art today. We'd have fewer maintenance needs because everything would be brand new, but that has a huge price tag. So that's actually, that provided a good segue to the next slide talking about pricing. But basically, to answer your question, I don't see anything on the horizon that would make us want to wait. And it's not quite like waiting for the next model year car. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, thanks, Bill.
Okay, thank you. We will, so what we've done here is summarize the costs, and remember they're they're rough order of magnitude. And so I've listed them in order of the scenarios, and you can see that the costs correspond from cheapest to most expensive. And yes, we've reduced or brought back all the costs to present value, so they're easier to compare. They're kind of in the middle of this chart is a ranking of the non-monetary factors, and a higher number is better. And we just ranked based on these different non-financial elements, and it's subjective, and it's also a forced rank. So say risk, ease of implementation, the difference between 1 and 2 could be very narrow, and the difference between 2 and 3 might be huge. We haven't represented that here. We tried to keep it simple just to provide another way of looking at these different options besides just looking at the price tag. And over there, not all the way to the right, we've added up the total benefit points. So again, higher is better. And you can see, not a surprise, but that building a new plant right now has the most benefit. We also looked at, in the far right column, benefit cost ratio. So, the cost in dollars for each of those benefit points. Again, it's pretty rough, but it's another way to look at it. And you can see, in this case, the scenario for building a new water treatment plant had the lowest cost per benefit, not overall, but cost per benefit. And something that's interesting here, it had option 4 had the highest benefit points, and it does have the best cost-benefit ratio, but looking at the difference, the others that are considerably cheaper are, cost-benefit wise, are closer than the cost alone would tell you. Even between, scenario 4 and 1, scenario 4 costs almost twice as much, but its cost-benefit ratio is only 25% better. So again, these are not conclusive evaluations. When you could go a lot deeper on some of these non-monetary factors and evaluate them. But for this purpose, it serves the purpose of giving us a way to look at the issues.
Bill, just quickly on that chart, why would option 4 or scenario 4 represent the highest risk to the system? Is that because we're not spending any money on the current plant while we're building the new one, or why is that one then? That seems like an outlier.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I think that was the answer when we discussed that in that scenario, we're not spending anything on the existing plan, but we have the highest risk to the system.
So while we're building the new
That's
plant,
right.
if something
That's right.
happens.
That we've got to keep the old one going. Thank you. That we've got to keep the old one going, so there's risk there, that we're investing less in its future.
But that risk would end as soon as it's up and running. I mean, once it's up and running, it's the best option in terms of
Correct.
reliability and all that kind of thing.
Yes.
Okay.
So that summarizes the scenarios at the water treatment plant. And if you're ready, I was going to transition to talking about how we get the water to the treatment plant.
Just kind of, I guess, briefly on this scenarios here, in terms of the difference between a whole new plant and upgrading the existing plant. When we do, looking at scenario 1 with all the different things that would be either replaced or upgraded or that sort of thing. I mean, once all that work is done, that rehab and replace timeline 21 to 24, would the facilities at the existing treatment plant still not be as good as they would be if we built new? And is that why would they not be, right? I mean, because again, simplistically, I'm looking at it like a Lego sort of building, right, where you pull out that old piece and plug in the new one, and now that new piece is just as good as it would be if you built a brand new plant. And if we're pulling out the old bad stuff and putting in new good stuff, why is that rehab plant not at the same level as a new plant would be? That makes sense?
Partially because all the Lego bricks may not fit right back in the same slot.
Okay.
So we've got, we're not upgrading or replacing every facility at the water treatment plant. And so you've got piping, wiring, a lot of connections, things that are feeding different directions that maybe you would put, if you were doing a new plant, you'd put two things side by side, but when we're rehabbing, you can't do that because there's no room. Some things like I can't think of a good example, but we're not replacing everything. If we were replacing everything, then you'd be spot on.
So home remodel, instead of tearing the whole thing down and building it brand new, I'm putting new stuff in, but my old layout may still be kind of wonky. I really wish my laundry room was on the other side of the house, but I've got a new washer and dryer, but the layout's still bad. I mean,
Right.
that's what we're...
Or your foundation wasn't so good,
Okay.
and so you're potentially, the good bones metaphor that Monty used earlier is part of that. You've got some piping things that are challenges, like the piping that drains the SCU basins has a low point in it.
Mm-hmm.
In the water treatment business, you'd prefer those to be gravity. So you've still got some constraints that you may have to fix later, or that you just have to live with.
So even if we spent everything we wanted to spend on the current facility, it's still going to have limitations over what we could build if we started brand new and laid everything out exactly the way we wanted it.
Yes, to some degree. It'll still have some limitations, but also it'll still have some needs that we'll have to meet. You know, well, we've got that. We've got replacing those SCUs in the future in yellow there in scenario 1. Anything I should add to that question or to the answer to that question?
Mostly, the filters are brand new, the ozone and recharge are brand new, that north blue brand new chemical facility replaces the other chemicals. There's a lot of new with that option. We're gonna go away from the CO2 part of we do have a structure out there that's got some kind of a structural defect.
Yeah.
We're not very,
Yeah, sorry. You can, yeah, if you can. We can hear him just fine, Elaine.
I just wanted to point out, there is a lot of this that is new. The ozone, the filters, the north rectangle building is a brand new chemical building that'll replace all the old. So there's a lot of positive. Everything that you see in dark blue, the new admin, the new finished water pump station, the new clear well, all that are new facilities that replace some of the old. So although there will be leftover yard piping, leftover wiring that Bill's talking about, there's going to be some old things. There's quite a bit here that's a completely restored existing plant that will change the way Thomas thinks about his life, I think, from day to day. But it will still, like you say, when you remodel a house and you get new flooring and new cabinets and new countertops and whatever, it's still going to have some old features that you'll never get away from.
Thank you.
Sorry. I don't mean to interrupt.
Okay, thanks, Candy. That is Candy Starring, our capital program manager. And we've mentioned Thomas a couple of times, so I'll just introduce him. Thomas Novotny is our water treatment superintendent.
We appreciate you guys being here.
Okay. Anything else on the scenarios? Okay, so at Call Lake, we have 50 MGD of water rights. So we're, in that regard, we're, set for the foreseeable future. We have completed water line and pump station improvements based on a evaluation back in 2012. And currently we are developing an RFQ kind of along the same lines that I talked about improvements at the water treatment plant. We're doing the same at CAW and developing this RFQ to further evaluate and recommend action on the next steps to take care of the rehabilitate the CAW water line. They were constructed just a couple of years ahead of the water treatment plant. The water line, as you've probably heard in the past and have alluded to, the water line needs attention to rehabilitate its condition, and it will not carry 24 MGD. It'll carry our current treatment capacity of 18. I think it carries about 21. There are challenges to a more in-depth evaluation of the condition of the water line. That's why that wasn't completed in 2012. The pump station is in good condition because of the improvements that we've made there, but it cannot pump 18 MGD. As it is, its capacity, firm capacity, which just means rated capacity in compliance with DEQ regs, is 14 MGD. And neither the pump station nor the water line includes redundancy for certain emergency situations.
So if something goes wrong with the pipeline, you're kind of up a creek for a little while.
Correct.
That's kind of the weak point. That's the weak point in the redundancy in the system.
Yes, sir.
in that there is no redundancy.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, we have one
Yeah.
pipeline. But the pump station, for instance, it has multiple pumps. There's 5 pumps, 2 large and 3 small. So the 2 large are redundant. So if one of them needs repair, it fails, you switch to the other one. You use the 3 smaller ones, you know, you seasonally you switch between the 2 sets of pumps.
Yeah.
But we have some redundancy there. And through these scenarios, you know, we'll talk about condition, capacity, and redundancy. So unlike the water treatment plant scenarios where all 4 options were equal, these are not. For instance, redundancy, well, I'll explain it as we go through them. So looking at scenario 1, it would include coating and repairing the existing 36-inch water line, constructing a new parallel 36-inch water line, and expanding the call pumping station. So, as you just mentioned, Trustee, having 2 lines, you know, now we're not down to one weak link, we can switch back and forth. However, in that scenario, we're still vulnerable to a pump station outage or a lake outage, you know, if something quality or water quality wise or mechanical happens at the lake. And note there at the bottom of the screen, I've got the OSU water treatment plant. We have an agreement with OSU to back each other up in times of need. They can, and both are able and willing to do that. The issue is they could not support us in the summer. They just don't have that capacity. So in the winter and for a planned outage and for short times at other times of year, they could help back us up. Scenario 2 includes a new 42-inch water line, abandoning the existing 36-inch water line, expanding the pumping, just like with scenario 1, but this also includes developing the infrastructure to utilize Lake McMurtry as a backup system. We have some water rights in Lake McMurtry. It would take some work to convert them to using for drinking water. We'd have to build infrastructure over to from Lake McMurtry to the water treatment plant and a pump station to be able to use it. So one thing that does is it gives us a buffer for planned work. You know, with the 42-inch line in this scenario, we still only have 1 line. And someday we're going to need to do work on it. So the Lake McMurtry system, unless we keep it full all the time, it would only be a planned backup. It wouldn't be an emergency backup. Just depend in the summer when the yield of the lake is not enough to keep up with our needs.
I'm sorry, Bill, can you say that again? The lake, if we did build a secondary line to Lake McMurtry, it wouldn't be something that was like automatically on if we needed it to. It would only be something we could spin up when we needed it?
Well,
Or if we
there's
plan to?
2 potential ways to look at that. One would be the lake is there, we get what we can get out of the lake and we pump it to the treatment plant. That has its own issues because now we're mixing 2 different water sources and that can create quality challenges, treatment challenges. So that's one way to utilize Lake McMurtry. Another way would be to actually, when we pump water from Caw, to use it to fill Lake McMurtry and then pump it out when we need it. That still requires either planning on when you're going to need it, or it requires keeping it full all the time. And that, you probably get tired of hearing saying, but that has its own challenges too, because then we're putting, you know, Caw water in Lake McMurtry, which even if there's not technical issues there could be regulatory or public perception issues.
We can't just have two separate water lines. So the first option you're saying is you have these two separate water lines and you just mix them together at the plant as they come in and you treat them together and they both go out. And we're sort of constantly feeding the plant with two different sources.
That, we wouldn't plan to do it that way,
Okay.
because we would prefer not to mix water all the time.
Okay.
And the amount of yield that we have in Lake McMurtry is not enough to really make that worthwhile.
Okay.
It would be more as an emergency backup.
Just the backup. Okay.
Scenario 3, it's similar to 2 in that we develop, but instead of using Lake McMurtry, construct a terminal reservoir. Now, it's not, we could build it bigger, but trying to, just looking at similar costs, it would be, there it says 167 million gallons, whereas we've got 315 available in Lake McMurtry. So it's not nearly as big, so it doesn't give nearly the buffer, but it could be online. We don't have to build the infrastructure to Lake McMurtry. We don't have the mixing challenges and the potential objections to using Lake McMurtry as a storage source for water.
So that would be filled with water that we pump from Caw.
Exactly.
We just have a big lake here that we keep it in just in case something happens between here and Caw and we need to use it.
Correct.
Okay.
And that could be, essentially at the water treatment plant. It could be somewhere along the Caw water line. This scenario also includes not building a complete parallel line, but just parallel in the highest risk areas. It would assume that the two river crossings and the lake crossing are high-risk areas. The evaluations may find others where either, just due to soil conditions or the condition of the pipe when it went in where it's deteriorated more, we may have more risky areas. But we would have parallel lines in limited areas to increase the resiliency of the water line itself, and then have the terminal reservoir for backup. Okay, so as I mentioned, these options are not all equal, so there's varying levels of risk. But also it's we have the ability to mix and match. We could build a parallel line and, well, you can see the different elements, and a parallel line with the terminal reservoir or with Lake McMurtry, or go with, so anyway, just that we have we're not stuck to the strict options themselves. So again, like on the previous chart for the water treatment plant, these costs are all brought back to present value for comparison. They are all rough order of magnitude, just for getting a feel of the magnitude and the relative weight of the different options. We similarly developed or ranked the non-monetary benefits. Again, higher is better for those higher points. We have total benefits there, and on the far right, again, a cost-benefit ratio, just to compare have a feel for the options and their benefits and risks. Here, I'd like to show you, we will definitely not go into any detail on this slide, but just show you the work that went into developing these options. Getting cost estimates for different infrastructure and different facilities. You can see the spread out when we know projects would take 3 or 4 or 5 years, so we've spread out the costs. You can see across the top, you can't read it, but the top line has O&M for the different scenarios. And we've made estimates in the out years. I mentioned we looked at 50 years out. So we've estimated when additional improvements would be needed. Okay, and I would, if you don't have any questions here, I'll move on and talk about demand, kind of circling back to the 18 versus 24 MGD that you asked about earlier.
You mentioned on these options, mixing and matching. I mean, there's the water line issue itself. Do we build a parallel? Do we build partly parallel? Do we just replace it with a new one? I mean, that seems separate from the reservoir issue. Do we build our own reservoir for storage? Do we connect to McMurtry? I mean, from the perspective of, I mean, it seems fairly straightforward. Building just segments of parallel would be the cheapest option. Building a second 36-inch line parallel would be the second cheapest option, but replacing the whole thing with 42 would be the most expensive. Is that?
Possibly. I don't remember the numbers, because if we build the parallel, the 36 is cheaper than a 42, but we'd have to rehab the old 36.
Okay.
So that adds some of the cost.
Okay. Whereas if we build the 42, we're just getting rid of the other 36.
Correct.
Okay. What's the difference in capacity if we had 142 versus 236? I mean, is it linear? I mean, 236-inch lines are.
Well, it's not linear for that size. It's linear for the cross-sectional area of the pipes.
Sure.
236s would definitely carry more.
Carry a lot more than
Yeah.
42,
The
right?
thinking with that is when you've got 236s with either line, say in the winter, you could just use one and rehab the other. So each line has to be big enough to handle the average flow.
So you'd want to build something that, and you said right now the current 36-inch line has a capacity of about 21 million gallons a day.
Yes, sir.
So we would just normally use one at a time, or how would that work? Would they both be flowing?
Yeah, until we grow into that, needing all that capacity. We'd probably use both to keep them both in service, but we could get by on one or the other.
If we needed to shut one down and fix it, we
Correct.
could. Okay.
But we also, another part of the reason for the new one being 36 is the 36 we rehab is probably not going to last 50 years. So we've got to not just be thinking about tomorrow, but the day after as well.
How old is the current pipeline?
Early 80s.
Okay.
Okay, December of 81, it was accepted and put in service, or I guess it was put in service.
So with the bypasses, the sectional bypasses you're proposing in option 3 for the existing pipeline, how much more time does that buy you on the existing 36?
Oh, can I come back to that in just
Yeah,
one second?
sure.
'Cause sorry, the chair's question made me think of something else. Whether we parallel, whether we replace, whether we partially parallel can somewhat be looked at on its own, but not entirely. Because if we have two parallel lines, we could say, we don't need a terminal reservoir. We don't need to use, we have two lines now, we're good to go. There's other risks, but that's part of that. That's part of why the different facilities are somewhat linked.
Okay, because if you have the two parallel lines, the risk of having your flow shut off is much lower. And so you
Right,
don't
but it's
necessarily
not
need
zero.
that. Yeah, it's not, yeah.
Because you could have problems at the lake level, right?
Correct, at the lake, at the pump station.
If all the pumps failed at the same
Yeah,
time, you'd be,
potentially a fuel spill that damages both pipes if they're close enough that's pretty remote.
that was actually going to be one of my questions when you talk about parallel pipelines. I mean, how close together are these parallel pipelines? It seems like something cuts one if they're particularly, I don't know how close together you're talking about. I mean, are we talking about feet apart or are we talking about?
Probably 20 to 40 feet apart.
Okay.
You wouldn't want them right side by side because you want to be able to work on one
Sure.
without hitting the other.
Well, I have no idea what kinds of things happen that could cause damage to a pipeline, but I mean, you would think that if they were somewhat close together, the same thing could cause damage to both. But you're not talking, I would assume we're not talking about some traumatic event happening that causes a rupture in a pipeline, but more like deterioration or some kind of long-term effect that causes most of the problems here?
Could be, yeah. If corrosive soils might affect both pipelines. If, the earthquakes that we had 5 or 6 years ago, if one was bad enough to rupture a pipeline, it could do both of them.
Yeah.
But again, those are, much lesser probability once you have two lines of having them both go down. Now, sorry, will you ask your question again?
Yeah, so with scenario 3, how much more time do those sectional bypasses, those are like coronary artery bypasses. That's what those are. So how much more time does that buy you on that existing line? If you put those in?
Yeah, that's, that's what it does is it decreases the odds of a line failure.
Yeah.
Because you've
You
repaired the
bypass
worst
all the
parts.
bad segment. You bypass
Yeah.
the block. Right. So,
Um,
how much time does that buy you for that line in total? I know that's kind of a loaded question because there's a lot of variable there, but.
The parallel replacement sections would be like under the river and under the lake that would take you a lot of time to replace. So yes, you're still vulnerable on the others, but the others are days or a week to repair, which depending upon when it happened, we could survive. But underneath the river, the lake could be a substantial amount of time. So that's really the thought process behind the parallel line, is get the critical areas now.
Would it make sense to do that like in state? If we're talking about just doing segments of parallel lines now on the most critical areas, then, over the next several years, we continue to add sections so that we eventually end up with a fully parallel.
Yeah, that could be a hybrid between option 2 or 3, scenario 3 and,
One.
either of the other ones.
Yeah.
Could be the first step towards that.
Okay.
I think what this would do, it doesn't increase your odds of having a line break, but it decreases your odds of having a catastrophic line break that you can't fix. And it takes a very long time.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, the money in that slide is in addition to none of that's cumulative with the water treatment plant itself, right?
Correct.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, nice try.
At least they're not as big. Okay, now I'd like to talk a bit about the capacity that we've alluded to several times. Currently at 18, and we believe that as a growing community, we're going to need to expand to 24 MGD someday. That is not imminent, but how do we know when it is? So here we've got a trend of our demand, which basically means how much water the treatment plant treated and pushed to distribution, usage by customers essentially. That peachy color up high is a max day, which means in any of those years, the max day we had almost always during the summer. The green diamonds represent the average day for the year. Note, so we're looking at about 12 million gallons a day for the annual max day and a little over 6 for the average day. Let's see, and here, here what we've done is take out the irrigation. So this is average day between December and March. So that way we know, or we expect there's not very much irrigation going on. So we're trying to see what is our base usage, unaffected by, since irrigation demand is very weather dependent and not controllable, we wanted to see what's the base. And notice on both of these graphs, if you've been in Stillwater the last 20 years, you think we're a growing community. There's a lot going on. Why aren't these graphs trending up? And so that was the question we were asking ourselves, because both of them are pretty flat, actually down a little. One thing to note is the vertical line at 2010 is when OSU stopped purchasing water from us. So that could make a difference. Anything after that would be decreased by maybe 1 to 1.5 million gallons a day. But still, that doesn't explain it entirely. So we're wondering why this is happening. And so this chart is a historical chart of rainfall in Oklahoma for the past 100 years. And each, the black diamonds are the annual precipitation, and the line graph with the green or the brown shading is the 5-year tendencies. I assume that means 5-year, the average of the previous 5 years, but I don't know that for certain. So the biggest thing you can see here, we've drawn a line early 1980s. And before that, you see more dry than wet. You see it dry more often. You see the dry areas in brown are bigger than the green areas in wet. Since 1980, you can see that there's more wet and there's a lot of wet. So we've had, precipitation-wise, a lot of wet, a lot higher than historical over the last 30 years. So what we did there, is overlay the two graphs. So you see our demand, the base demand graph that I showed you earlier, and the rainfall graph from the 90s to the late 2010s. And this is a little bit hard on the eyes, but you can see that there's a correspondence between our higher demand years and the drier years. And so that, we think what that does is that kind of puts our not increasing demand in perspective and kind of may explain why. I mean, we can't say with that for certainty, but that seems to make the data make more sense.
There's also in the last 30 years, a pretty big expansion on water saving technologies, right? I mean, my toilets and shower heads and all that stuff are conserving more water than they did 10, 20, 30 years ago, right? I mean,
Yes,
I would
sir.
assume
Yeah,
that
that
has
could be
some.
part of it. Could be better water devices. Could just be more environmentally conscious customers. Could be that as rates have gone up over time, people have become more cost conscious and cut back just to save money. So a lot of things can go into it.
People aren't drinking enough water. Drink more water. Come on.
And not bother.
Right. Yes.
The other thing is, as we've made improvements to the distribution system, we're doing better technology, better materials, which then reduces how many leaks we have in the system.
So it's a more efficient system than it was
Intangible losses.
30 years ago, yeah.
So these on this slide are just a lot of the factors that could change water demand, either direction. And another thing to remember is we saw this, there was a spike on the graphs back in 2005 or 6, and also another in 2012 and 13. You may remember the record hot and dry summers that could happen again any summer. So we have to be ready for that. We can't just say, oh, we don't need to expand. But mostly what this goes to show you is that it's pretty hard to predict when we're going to need 24 MGD.
Is there I mean, we're set up for 18 MGD now, but the pump station only pumps about 14, and we're only using, on an average day, 6 or 8. Is there an issue of the percentage of the demand of your plant that you're actually running through it? Like if you've got a 24 MGD plant, but you're only running 8 a day through it, does that cause issues with, I mean, I'm just trying to think of other systems sometimes, if you're not using them at capacity, you're not.
Correct. No, that would not hurt. What we'll do, we looked at the 3 SCU clarifiers earlier. You ramp one up and you use it. When your demand's down, you turn one off. So you probably lose a little efficiency, but mostly if you only use it at 75% of capacity or 50%, you've just overinvested. There's not particularly harm in it.
Okay.
And I will, if there's no more questions, I will turn it over to Monty to wrap things up.
Thank you, Bill. Trustees, counselors, any questions for Bill?
One last question, Bill. With that last comment, if you're to overinvest in a system like this, does that extend the life of that overall system? So, for example, with the SCUs, if you're not using them, if you're only using them half the time, for example, does that increase the lifespan of those devices or those structures, or does that not have any bearing?
I think it could go both ways a little bit. One, maybe you're not maxing out your pumps and motors all the time if you're not operating at capacity, but I don't see that being a huge issue. And on the reverse, if you're not using it, kind of like, if you buy an extra car and just leave it sit in the driveway, it's going to deteriorate anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't see that as being going easier on the equipment as being a big factor.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the advantage of the style of plant that we have, the solid contact unit, and the 3 trains, and they're designed in 6 MGD trains. So basically, Thomas can turn one off. I think the minimum's about 4 million you got to have to run through those. So he's got to have at least 4 million to run through one, but he can go up to 6. So he's got flexibility there before he has to add the second one. Go ahead.
Sorry, just is there a sweet spot? Like if your average is 8 a day, or your high might be 10 or 12, that you want to build at least 18 just in case? I mean, is there any kind of standard around kind of how that number gets calculated based on your usage and in terms of what you want your capacity to look like?
I don't know that there's a particular sweet spot, but it's in terms of what do you think your capacity is going to be, and then how do you get that how long is that peak going to last?
Yeah.
And then you have to match that with your filters, and match that with your pumps, and with your storage. And then you put all those pieces together, looking at a peak day 50 years from now. That'd be a good job.
With a crystal ball,
Yeah,
right?
I just add a little bit if I could. There's kind of a rule of thumb in the industry that when you hit 80%, maybe 75, but 80% of your peak capacity, that's when you start planning for an expansion.
Okay.
But it also kind of depends on, if you wait too late to expand, you risk having development catch up with you and getting to the point where you couldn't accept a new industrial customer or new meters because you've maxed it out.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Before we kind of move on, I wanted to make a couple other points. The Lego brick example and discussion, again, you put the new brick in, but the bricks around it are still 40 years old. And how long will they last? Recognizing that this is a public discussion and there are other public entities, using McMurtry has a lot of challenges. One of those is you're transferring water from one basin to another basin, which the Water Resources Board is going to have a lot of concerns about that. The bigger concern is our neighbors and friends to the northwest at Perry use Lake McMurtry as a source of their drinking water. So if we start putting cold water in there, that could very well drastically affect their treatment. And so we would have to consider all those issues. And if there was a cost to them, we would likely bear that cost as well. So it's an option. It's an option that has to be vetted. But it's an option with a lot of challenges. And I would not want to leave the impression that we think that's the way to go and give a lot of angst and concern to other public entities.
Sure. Along those same lines about the lakes themselves, I think, is it Enid that just built a new line or is building a new line to Caw?
They're in the process of designing it, correct.
Do we have any concerns about the long-term viability of Caw to meet our 15, 20, 30 million?
We still have our water rights at 50 MGD, is that correct?
Yeah.
So we still have our water rights, and they would still have theirs.
But
so the Corps believes that lake would supply both of us.
And Caw, we don't have any concern about Caw being able to
No.
supply that kind of,
No.
right? I mean, it's been one of the more stable
Correct.
reservoirs in the state, right?
Correct. Again, to re-emphasize that these are just some options we came up with. At some point, we got to quit playing what ifs. We definitely see there could be some others and some mix and match with these. I think one other thing I wanted to mention about the existing plant and part of the poor bones, those solid contact units is where you drop out the dirt that's in the water, in the sediment, and some of the chemicals that you put into it. And then you have to blow those down, and that's what goes to the recycled lagoons, is also the wash water from the filters. Back to the original design and the difference between the energy sector. At a refinery, you basically have clear liquids that have no solids in them. But you're worried about gases coming off that can be explosive. So you design the drain systems so that anytime you have a junction or a manhole, the outlet pipe is higher than the inlet pipe. Therefore, you keep the pipe full of liquid, and you don't get the gases and the explosions. That works well for clear liquids. When you've got solids, you drop the solids out into the manholes or in the pipes, and that gives you a big problem. So that means you have to flush more water. That's one of Thomas's big problems, is he's always running water down those lines to clean them out, which puts more water in our lagoons, which gives us a bigger problem to recycle and more storage. So that's some of the poor bones. And to go in and correct that now and do that around existing tankage and pipes is a challenge as well. Doesn't mean it's not the best option, but it's just part of what we're talking about of, do you rethink staying at that site? So towards that end, what we think is probably in the best interest is for us to go out and get a construction manager at risk and a design firm. Put together a team, sit down, look at our options, refine those better, have the construction manager give us better costs and a better evaluation of what it'd take to fix some of our things. The example I like to use on this is, excuse me, when I was at OSU and we built one of the big research labs, we were going down one path, and the researcher said, well, we need that, with the kind of research we're going to do, we'll get real sensitive instruments, we can't have vibrations in the building. The original plan was to make that a steel frame building, but you get a lot of vibrations. You go to a concrete frame, you get less. So the question was asked, how much more would it cost us to do concrete frame? The architect said, oh, really not that much more. You're going to trade this for that and on and on. And, you know, it'd be okay. Fortunately, we had a construction manager in the room. He said, no, you're wrong. It will cost you this many more $1 million, and it's going to add 6 months to the construction. And then they gave us the reasons why. So there's a lot of value in having that knowledge at this stage of trying to figure out what's going on. And then that also gives us flexibility moving forward. In particular, like we discussed, we got the problems with the lime system. If we decide that we really have got to get that done, we've got the CMAR on board, we've got the design team on board, we can get that component designed and bid it out. And do that and not have to wait on the rest of it, because we've got the team in place to do it. That may mean that the final decision, that isn't used, but at least we've got the plant still going. And to us, that's one of the values we have. So we're not asking for authorization to do that tonight. It may be a nod that says, yeah, we think that's the way to go. We'll start that process and then come back later to get the authorization to retain people in the budget. Mm-hmm. And Bill and I and Candy, happy to answer any additional questions. Thomas, I want to say again how much work particular Candy has put in on this based on the other things. The spreadsheet that you just saw a piece of took a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of research to look at 50 years out and try and come up with some good numbers. Mm-hmm. They did really good work.
We appreciate that work. Trustees, questions, comments?
Just to say how thankful I am for the information. It was very thorough and very helpful as we kind of just even to start to think about the planning process. It's good to have some of that baseline information. I don't think very many of us come into this role knowing an awful lot about our water treatment plant. So very helpful to understand kind of what equipment's out there and how all of that works. So I appreciate the really in-depth presentation. Thank you for all that work.
Yeah, really helpful presentations, and good to have a pretty clear picture of what these issues are, and certainly seems like it's time to start stepping forward on what we're going to do about getting these systems where they need to be for the next 50 years of our community. So it would certainly make sense to me to have you guys start talking to construction managers and getting us a better picture of what the options might look like and how we might move forward.
The other comment I wanted to make, and I'm sorry I didn't make it earlier, we understand the community has a lot of needs and desires and a lot of quality of life issues, and we share those. Of course, it starts with water, mm-hmm. and the other thing is it starts with electricity. If you don't have electricity, you don't have water. But we are committed to finding the optimal cost so that as a community we can do other things other than put all our resources in just this one basket.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it is electricity and water are sort of those core infrastructure things that we've just got to have, and it does play, I mean, when we talk about what would increase our demand, and we talk about new industrial users and population growth and that sort of thing. I mean, we do have people who come and ask us, hey, how much water could you provide if we wanted to bring an industry here, and how much, that sort of thing. It plays into quality of life, not just the fact that I can pull clean drinking water out of my sink, but can we attract new business? Can we attract new development? Do we have the capacity and the quality of that kind of infrastructure to do that? So it plays into a lot of those things, sometimes in ways that we don't really think about, right? I mean, we talk about this all the time at SUA, right? Most of this stuff that you guys do every day, none of us see until we turn the tap on or we flip a switch. And sometimes it's hard to fathom the fact that, you know, we've got potentially $500 million worth of stuff that you're looking at over the course of, you know, changing the, replacing the treatment plant and the pipelines and all that sort of thing. But it is the backbone of any community. So, yeah, but we certainly do want to balance that against the fact that it's a ton of money, and there's lots of other things that we need to spend money on as well. But so those discussions will certainly continue, and we'll continue to talk through it. But again, certainly appreciate this information and the thoroughness of the estimates. I certainly appreciate the historical trends on the climate and kind of seeing how that matches up with our usage. That's really interesting information to have. So really appreciate the thoroughness and all the information tonight and all the work you guys do to keep all this stuff up and running. So look forward to talking more about it here over the course of the next few months. Trustees, anything further? All right. That takes us to the end of the agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn this joint meeting of the Stillwater City Council and Stillwater Utilities Authority?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to adjourn. Teresa, please call the roll.
Mayor Joyce,
Yes?
Councilor Zanotti,
Yes.
Councilor Redlake,
Yes.
Councilor Jaloski.
Yes.
With a vote of 4-0, we're now adjourned.